Great. Thank you so much. It's nice to meet everyone. Thanks so much to Ryan Grid for organizing this. I'm very excited to share this with you and also to hear what you think and what parts of it are useful. Hopefully, some parts of it are useful. As Dan said in the introduction, I've been working on this theme of radical imagination for a number of years. You can see the slide, eh?
Mhm.
Looking good. Okay, good. Yeah, I've been working on the question of the radical imagination for quite a few years, I guess probably since around 2008. But my sort of encounter with what I would eventually call the radical imagination began a lot before that. I grew up in Canada in an activist household. My family, all of my family, both my parents and my brother and me, are all social activists on a wide range of issues. My parents were trade union organizers. My mother was an independent investigative journalist. My father was a trade union representative, and then both my parents eventually went back to the university and became professors. My brother was a student activist. Today, he's Palestine solidarity activist. And I've had a long history in various forms of activism as well. I grew up in what I guess we could call the alter globalization movement or anti-globalization movement of the late 90s, early 2000s. And so from a very early age, I had a kind of anti-capitalist analysis, but also one that was very informed by feminism, queer theory and queer politics, and anti-imperialism and anarchism as well. Because growing up with that kind of analysis in the 1990s, we were very aware of the kinds of authoritarian dimensions of many kinds of Marxism. I still was trained as a Marx cultural theorist when I went to grad school years later. Um, but essentially, through all of that, I got a lot of experience working with a lot of different kinds of social movements and a lot of different kinds of activists over the years. Also, for many years in Canada, when I lived there, presently I'm living in Berlin. I'm also involved in various sort of anti-racist and anti-colonial movements as well that are trying to work against the settler colonial framework of the Canadian state. All of these in a very small way. I've never really been part of a social movement that has been very victorious. I'm not saying this to say that I have a lot of experience of like leading or being part of movements that really change a lot, but I have a lot of experience of being in movements, as I'll discuss in this presentation, that are in between success and failure. I'll talk a little bit in this presentation about some of the things that we learned while writing the book, which you see on your right here, The Radical Imagination, which I co-wrote with Alex Kasnavish, my friend who is a professor in Halifax as well, the Canadian city of Halifax. And one of the conclusions we came to in that book, which I think is really important, is that most social movements never really succeed in the thing they think they're setting out to do. But they also don't just fail. And a lot of the sort of academic research on social movements, and also a lot of like histories that social movements and social movement protagonists tell themselves, is focused on, did it succeed? Did it fail? Did we win our objectives? Did we fail to win our objectives? And one of the kind of key things that we learned is that's it's not a very useful framework, because social movements and social movement activities and activism and organizing, and in general, fighting for a better world, um, even when we look at those movements that appear in hindsight to have been successful, they rarely feel that they're successful in the moment. Usually they feel, and the people in them feel like they're in between success and failure. A lot of my research then, both as sort of an activist and an academic, has been about the imagination in a lot of different ways. One of them has to do with the radical imagination of social movements, which I'm going to talk about today. But if you look on the left, there's a number of other books that I've written that are about imagination in other ways. So the last book I wrote was about palm oil and about how this commodity, which is in a huge number of things, from the cosmetics we use on our skin and hair, to many of the processed foods we eat, to many sort of industrial products, how there's a connection between the way that we imagine the world and the way that the world is created out of things like palm oil. So it's an attempt to somehow bridge the material and the imaginary. I wrote a book before that about revenge and the politics of revenge. I've looked a lot in my work at art and artists and how artists try and understand the capitalist economy that they're in and respond to it. And I've written quite a bit about financialization and the way that imaginary money becomes real, and disappears as well. So the imagination has been this like long-term sort of fascination of mine. And these days, down at the bottom, you'll see the logo for a recent initiative I started with my friend Sarah Stein-Lubrano, who lives in London, called Sense and Solidarity, which is a kind of platform where we're bringing together our expertise on me on the imagination and her on cognitive sciences to try and figure out what do social movements need to know about these topics. So this is all just to say my engagements with the imagination are long and there's a lot of different dimensions to them. But today I'm going to talk to you a bit about this project that my friend Alex Kasnabish and I started in the small Canadian city of Halifax in about 2010, called the Radical Imagination Project. Alex and I went to graduate school together near Toronto, which is very far away from Halifax in Canada. And there we sort of connected around our dissatisfaction with the way that most academics were thinking about social movements. A lot of academics look at social movements as if they're kind of insects under a microscope. And they're very obsessed with these questions about, well, like what makes a movement succeed? What makes a movement fail? What are the lessons that we can learn? And a lot of the academic research on social movements is, from our perspective, very extractive in the sense that the academic sort of shows up and observes the social movement, watches them, takes notes, and then basically writes that up for an academic audience. And we were interested in what it would mean for us as academics who are also activists to give more back to the community that we were studying than we were taking away from it. Because academics, at least in Canada, have a fair amount of privilege and power and to a certain extent resources. And so we started this project called the Radical Imagination Project, also to study this term that had sort of fascinated us, but we were very also frustrated with. Because often when people would speak about the radical imagination, they did so very, very vaguely. It tended to be a term that evoked a lot of ideas, a lot of sympathy, a lot of romantic projection onto this idea, but it didn't really feel very substantial to us. So we wanted to do these sort of two tasks with this research project. And ultimately what we did is we developed a kind of methodology for studying the radical imagination as something that was living, as something that was active, and something that sparked between people in different radical movements. We interviewed about 30 or so protagonists in radical movements in this small Canadian city. These included feminist organizers, environmental organizers, student organizers, queer organizers, anti-capitalist organizers, anti-poverty organizers, all sorts of different people working on international solidarity campaigners, all sorts of people who are working on a variety of different projects who considered themselves to be radicals. And we left the definition of what radical means up to them. And what we wanted to do is study a social movement community, not just an individual movement, but a whole community of people who were, in our eyes, dwelling in between success and failure, as I mentioned before. None of these movements were particularly successful. And if we were honest, the city of Halifax is a very, very conservative city, and it's very, very unlikely that any of these movements would succeed at all. So we were very interested in how do social movements continue to keep hope alive and continue to sustain energy and reproduce themselves, even in the face of the fact that they have very little chance of succeeding, even by their own understandings. And the final thing that we wanted to do in this project, which we did over the span of about 5 years, was we wanted to create a methodology that anyone could use and that wasn't just useful to academics. So part of what I'm going to be presenting to you today, the methodology we ended up calling convocation, is a method that in various ways can be picked up like a toolkit and used not only by academics, but also by organizers, activists, educators, as a way to supplement or give a gift, hopefully, to the movements, to do something that helps movements, but that movements are very rarely doing for themselves. So just to go a little into the background, we approached this project being very skeptical of a certain idea of the imagination. And it's the idea of the imagination that emerges from a long history of quote unquote Western thought. This is what we call a romantic idea of the imagination, and it's sort of represented by this painting of Caspar David Friedrichs, very famously, of this sort of the imagination is this part of our spirit or part of our soul that rises up above the world and can somehow imagine what doesn't exist yet. It can imagine the future. It can imagine places we haven't been. It is a sort of individualized creative force. This is the way that we are taught to imagine the imagination, if you'll forgive the redundant phrase, that it's a kind of private space within our heads, that it is idiosyncratic and unique to every individual, and that ultimately the imagination is disembodied. It doesn't matter what your body is doing. Your mind sort of rises above the world and takes in and projects into the future. And that the imagination is also a universal sort of abstract force. Now, for all sorts of reasons, we wanted to move away from this definition. In the first place, it's a definition that emerges from the sort of Western patriarchal Enlightenment thought, which is all about the triumphant individual going out into the world and changing reality. And we wanted to move towards an idea of the imagination as a collective act, as something that people do together. We also wanted to move away from this idea of the imagination as a disembodied force that exists outside of how our bodies exist in the world. We wanted instead to pick up on feminist and anti-racist and anti-colonial ideas about how our ideas and our thoughts emerge from our embodied experience, and particularly how our ideas and our imagination emerge from our embodied experience relative to power relations around us. So if you live in a society, torn apart by racism, by class and poverty, by patriarchy and sort of heteronormativity, this is going to shape your imagination. It's going to shape how you imagine the future. It's going to shape who you think is valuable and who you think is worthless. It's going to shape who you think, how you imagine society could change. So all of these things we felt needed to be in a theory of the imagination that would be useful to social movements, that it needed to be collective and situated, and something that's active and alive in the world, something that's about transforming reality together. In this, we were also quite inspired by the work of C. Wright Mills, the American sociologist, theories of the sociological imagination, which it's a complex concept. But one of the things we take away from it is that the key to having an imagination of society is recognizing that your own personal story is connected to larger structural forces. That, the reason why you have the experience you have in the world, why your narrative is the way it is not just because of the choices you've made as an individual, but because of the broader structures and systems that you've been part of. And the sociological imagination for Mills is a kind of skill that we need to develop and cultivate, where we can connect our own personal stories to those systems. And through that, then ask questions like, are these systems legitimate? Can these systems be changed? What am I not seeing because of my relationship to these systems? Perhaps because you're born into a certain gendered body or racialized body, or because you have a certain experience of the economy by virtue of your social class. So for this reason, we ended up moving on a theoretical side of the project to a set of theories from this French-Greek philosopher named Cornelius Castoriadis. And Castoriadis essentially offers us an idea of the imagination as a material force in the world. A lot of the ideas of the imagination are very transcendent. They imagine it's a kind of lightning bolt from God, or it emerges from the kind of eternal human spirit. But Castoriadis was working in the psychoanalytic tradition and the Marxist tradition, and but against kind of authoritarian elements of both, and tried to understand how the imagination worked as a kind of social fact, as not something that was just inside individuals, but also connects all of society. And he provided this very beautiful metaphor of magma, this substance that's in between liquid and solid that comes up from a volcano. And not only does it come up from a volcano, it's actually underneath us all the time. It's sort of this substance that's in between the Earth's core and the surface underneath the continents. This kind of liquid, tectonic, destructive, but also creative force. And for Castoriadis, both inside every individual and in society at large, there is this sort of imaginative potential, this imaginative force that's underneath the surface. And what happens in the course of our lives, in the course of a society, is that every so often there is a kind of rupture, a break, and the magma of the imagination erupts to the surface. And then as it meets the kind of atmosphere of the world, it then solidifies. But what is quite useful from Castoriadis is he says, like, all of our senses of identity and also all of our social institutions are just momentary solidifications of this magma. It's like the magma comes to the surface, and as it gets exposed to air, it turns to stone. And then we look at those stones, whether it's the sense of who I am or a sense of social institutions, and we say, that must be eternal and forever. So a couple of examples. In one sense, Castoriadis' view is very sympathetic to like a Buddhist view of the self. It's the idea that, in fact, there's very little that's permanent about our egos, and that there's something that rises up constantly in us that is destabilizing. So I might think of myself as a professor, as a father, as a man, as somebody who lives in Berlin. Some of those are about relationships, but all of the narrative that I concoct about myself, that I develop about myself, is a kind of solidification of this magma that's underneath. But this can, of course, be very dangerous too, especially when people begin to organize themselves around their senses of identity. For instance, if you think about fascists or racists who try and hold on to a very specific idea of what it means to be a Canadian, what it means to be white, what it means to be a European. These things are always in flux, they're always changing, and yet the kind of authoritarian imagination is always trying to hold them and insists that they're internal, that they've always been this way and they could never be any different. But Castoriadis is not just thinking about the imagination in this way, he's also thinking about the imagination as the substance out of which everything in society is formed. So if you think about an institution like the police, we haven't always had police in our societies, right? They're a very recent invention in some sorts of ways. And yet if you ask most people, they would imagine that the social institution of the police has been with us since time immemorial. Or similarly, marriage, the idea of this kind of a nuclear family, of a married heterosexual couple as the basic unit of society. This is a very recent invention from mostly Western societies, so to say. But it appears to us, this institution, as if it's been with us forever, and it always will be with us, and that it's eternal and normal and natural. But what Castoriadis suggests is that just like our identities, all of these social institutions are also solidifications of the magma, of this sort of creative, imaginative force that flows beneath society and occasionally erupts. And what happens at certain points, and we can talk about them in the Q&A if you want, and what defines these moments is that there's another kind of eruption, a revolutionary eruption, maybe a social revolution, maybe a political revolution, maybe just a revolt or a smaller set of protests that change the way people see the world. And it's sort of the new magma shoots up into the world and destroys or at least transforms all of those seemingly permanent stone-like institutions and identities. But then, of course, the process continues. Those new formations of the magma solidify into new things we take to be eternal, natural, normal, and the process begins again. Now, there's a couple of things that are very useful about Castoriadis's definition of the imagination. First is it is material. It is a materialist theory. So it's not really depending on the idea that there's some eternal human spirits out there in the world. The second is it gives us reason to think about how minds change and how hearts change in moments of social upheaval. The metaphor of magma and eruption reminds us that as much as we need to plan and strategize about how to change society, sometimes, like the eruption of a volcano, we can't predict the moment. And we can't predict, like you can imagine magma flowing down a volcano. We can't necessarily predict the channel that it will take as it solidifies. There's a lot about how society changes that we simply can't know and can't anticipate. And so we have to start to develop strategies and tactics that are built upon not knowing, but still being ready. And the final thing is, I think the thing that this theory really gives us is some solace and some useful ways of thinking in moments when we don't know what to do. And I think we are in that moment right now. We're in a moment of a reorganization of global empires and imperialism. We're in a moment of horrifying new wars. We're in a moment when the myths of sort of Western universalism seem to be falling apart, but nothing seems to be replacing them. We seem to be in a moment of the rising of the far right and fascism, and we don't seem to know what to do about it. I think the notion of the magma here gives us a certain set of metaphors that are quite useful in this moment, because it encourages us to think about a politics of being ready, of readiness, rather than a politics of success and failure. And I think that might be what is important right now. Now, that's all a bit theoretical. I want to talk now about what we actually did in Halifax based on this theory. So Alex and I, when we were developing our methods around the radical imagination, started to come to an idea of what we called convocation. This is a kind of weird variation on a Latin word, but we contrasted it to two other things that social movement scholars tended to do. On the one hand, most social movement scholars have a strategy of what we call invocation. And that's sort of what I mentioned earlier, where the social movement scholar goes out and observes a social movement, and they're like, aha, here are my observations. I'm going to share them with other academics. They invoke or call up the social movements that they're studying. Then there's a strategy we talked about called evocation, or avocation, sorry, which is to be called away. And here we have a lot of friends who, as social movement scholars working in solidarity with social movements, just say, you know what, I'm just going to put my skills and my resources at the disposal of the social movement. They know how to use this. I'm just going to work for the social movement. And both Alex and I have done this, and we believe in it. But we also wanted to try a kind of third method, which we call convocation, from the Latin word of calling together. It's often used in like a religious context or an academic context for bringing people together. And our idea was that if the radical imagination is in fact magma-like, and it's a collective force, it's not just something of individuals, but it's something that exists between people, then how could we study the radical imagination by creating the circumstances when it would erupt, when it would spark between people? And so what we did is, first, we did many, many months of ethnographic interviews. So that basically took the form of 2 to 3 hour one-on-one conversations with these 30 different activists about all sorts of questions. And I'll talk to you a little bit about what those questions were in a moment. And we essentially wanted to get deep down into what people's motivations were, how they kept their hope alive, what their frustrations were. We wanted to build a lot of trust with the people that we were interviewing so that we could talk about what really mattered and what was really transformational. Then we organized, based on these, months of doing interviews with different activists, we organized a series of conversations between these activists. So we brought them all together into one room and said, we gave a sort of presentation and said, like, here's what we heard from you, what you said to us, but you're not saying to each other. So we'd have these rooms of 30 or 40 activists getting together, many people who hadn't seen each other at demonstrations or at organizing meetings, but had never taken the time to actually sit down and talk about motivation, talk about goals, talk about frustrations, talk about pain and heartbreak. And we tried to create a safer space for people to have those kinds of discussions. These are a kind of, shall we say, like, this is a space that movements wanted, it turned out, but that they were never going to organize themselves because nobody in the community really had built enough trust to be able to invite people from many, many different movements together to have these conversations. And then finally, we worked with Cinema Politica that Ezra and Svetla founded, who are here today. We started a chapter in Halifax, the city, where we invited our movement participants, the people we'd interviewed and worked with, to choose a film from Cinema Politica's catalog of activist documentaries and screen it at the public library and then make presentations based on that. So you see here a photograph of a screening. You can sort of see a panel. I think I might be on that panel in the back row, on the stage. And this was an opportunity for movements also to speak to one another, because people would come to the screening and they'd have conversations, but also speak to a wider public. So essentially what we were trying to do is become an infrastructure for the movements. We didn't want to become a social movement ourselves. We wanted to see if we could create something that would bring the social movements in the city together in a non-judgmental, non-partisan way. Now, obviously, Alex and I had our very strong opinions about many things. I'm from the city of Halifax. Alex moved there. We have lots of friends. We have enemies. We have, I'm not suggesting it was simple. Some people never trusted us. In the course of the project, we broke trust with a lot of people for all sorts of reasons I could talk about if you're curious. I'm not suggesting it worked out perfectly, but it was a very interesting kind of experiment based on this idea. How do you make a form of activism out of your research? How does research become a way of bringing people together in a way that adds more than it subtracts in a certain sense? So I want to kind of distill a few points here about that we kind of learned or that we were thinking about. Okay. I want to share with you a couple of questions we asked. So I think one of the most interesting and provocative questions we ended up asking when we were sitting down with each of those activists one-on-one is, what would it mean to win? And most people, when we asked them that, would just pause and stare at us. And then a number of very interesting things happened. And in the book, The Radical Imagination, and I can send you a PDF if you want, we try and sort of theorize this experience of what we call the pregnant pause. Like, why were people so hesitant to answer this question? And ultimately, I think what we determined is that for most activists, being in this world that is so far from the world we know is possible is actually quite harmful and heartbreaking. And dwelling with that heartbreak and that feeling of loss and that feeling of disappointment is a really important part of what it is to be struggling in these movements. But most people want, this is a particularly Canadian cultural habit, I don't know. Most people kind of want to avoid talking about that for all sorts of reasons. For some of the activists, it was because they believe that to be a good activist is to repress your emotions and to be kind of a stalwart, very serious, committed person. For some people, it was because they insisted on focusing only on the positive. But one of the things that we learned asking this question many times again and again and again is also that people very rarely had quite a developed view of what it would mean to win. Mostly after this kind of pause, they would sort of say something like, well, it would be a world without poverty, or it would be a world without environmental degradation, or it would be a world without patriarchy. Most of the answers to this question were negative. I don't think that's a problem. I don't think negative is a problem, but it was interesting to note that most people, when we asked them what would it mean to win, it was freedom from something rather than freedom to do something. And through that, we started to develop a set of methods for trying to invite people to have a more positive vision of the future. By positive, I don't mean like, oh, it's going to be bright, it's going to be a utopia. I simply mean like what it would mean to win. It means that we will all have enough to eat, that everyone can achieve their potential, that we can all contribute to society in the way we want to contribute, that we can express our gender and identity freely without fear. So coming to a more positive vision was one of the things that we ended up trying to cultivate. I've already spoken a little bit about this other thing that we learned, which is about what it means to dwell with movements between success and failure. And we've been theorizing this again and again over the years because it keeps on coming back again and again. You know, in a lot of the ways that academics talk about social movements, and also in a lot of the ways that the social movements speak about themselves, it's always this kind of assessment like, did we succeed or did we fail? Oh, those people who came before us, they failed. Oh, those people who came before us, they succeeded. And instead, we tried to map out in a kind of funny, complex way, if there's a way of thinking about us as social movement actors and people in solidarity with social movements, dwelling, as we said, like living together between success and failure, never fully failing, never fully succeeding, and somehow finding ways to be okay with that space and also leverage and mobilize in that space without losing hope and losing energy. Third, one of the things that we found that was really important about the process of the Radical Imagination Project is we essentially became movement therapists. In the sense that nobody had usually asked most of the activists we were talking with these questions. Nobody had ever bothered to sit down for 3 hours with them and ask them to explain how they became a radical activist from childhood to the present. Nobody ever asked them what would it mean to win. Nobody ever asked what's the most heartbreaking thing that's happened to you as an activist. No one had ever asked a question like, what do you wish you could tell the people in your movement that you feel you can't say? And ultimately, as researchers, solidarity researchers, let's say, we realized that we had a very important therapeutic role. And we could talk a lot more in the Q&A if you want about therapy and what kind of therapy this might be. But it's interesting to think about it in terms of some of the things that, for instance, Franco Bifo Berardi writes recently about how therapy has become a new kind of idiom for activism in various ways. Fourth, one of the things that we really dwelled with in an intense way was a certain kind of contradiction around what we spoke of as social reproduction and movements. So very briefly, social reproduction is a framework that Marxist feminist theorists have started to develop to talk about all of the important activity that goes on in society that's not just productive activity in like a factory or in the formal economy. So social reproduction doesn't just include the work of bearing and raising children. It also represents the labor of building community, of building relationships, of repairing relationships, of repairing the home and the space and community spaces. All of these different forms of labor that have traditionally been assigned to women and usually go unpaid, that are crucial to reproducing society. And the theory of social reproduction tries to recenter our focus, not on those classic sites of Marxist analysis like the factory, but instead on the home and on the community and on the sphere of social relations. On the one hand, social movements almost always are trying to have some sort of revolution at the level of social reproduction. Some social movements are very, very limited in their scope. They just want to change particular policies. But what we realized is in interviewing at least radical activists in Halifax is that most were also envisioning some sort of transformation of how society would work and how relationships would work. And this became a very important way of thinking about what social movements were demanding. Even if it was a student movement that was demanding a different policy at the university, very often that policy would be linked to how people would be in relationship with one another, how society would reproduce itself. So on the one hand, social movements were always thinking about social reproduction, even if they didn't admit it, even if they thought they were doing something different. But here was the contradiction. At the same time, at the same time as they were thinking about social reproduction, almost all of the activists we spoke with and almost all of the movements that we studied were also alternative spaces of social reproduction. So the activists within them were having friendships. They were sharing houses. They were becoming lovers and spouses and partners. They were having breakups between friends, between lovers. They were you know, in a whole kind of social world. The activist work became their kind of social world. And the social movements themselves became laboratories for other ways of reproducing society, of social reproduction. But fundamentally, this desire to change social reproduction on a society-wide scale and the social movement as a laboratory often came into conflict in all sorts of ways, some of which were very beautiful and generative, some of which were very destructive. But in our project, we really wanted to focus in on this contradiction and say that no matter how doctrinaire and straightforward a social movement claims to be, it's just working to change policy, right? Nothing here, nothing to see here. No way. Always there's this level of kind of experiment in living together differently. And those experiments are often quite utopian. People bring a kind of utopian imagination to them, in the sense that people believe, especially people who are raised in an era of what got called like prefigurative politics and feminist politics, that the way that you act within your social movement is supposed to be a model for the world you want to build. But even for people who didn't have that politics explicitly, it was still very important to dwell with the fact that social movements became these kinds of laboratories, but that work of being a laboratory was often in conflict and in friction with the actual stated objectives of the social movement in many cases, simply sometimes because it led to the breakdown of relationships and more. So these are some of the questions or lessons about the radical imagination we learned from the project. I'm going to stop there because I've been through a bunch about the theory and the methodology, and we could have a conversation. I hope you found it interesting. I'd be very curious if any of this applies to your experience or your context. This project was very firmly rooted in Halifax, and we wanted to keep our conclusions very specific to that area. So I don't know how much of it applies across and outside of certainly the North American context and certainly the Anglophone context. So I'd be curious to learn from you of what of it resonates. And then after the Q&A, I know we're going to take a break, and I'll come back and talk a little bit about some of the projects I'm doing right now, because this Radical Imagination project ended in about 2017. And I'm now working on a variety of other projects that sort of take off from this launching pad. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Max. So apparently the floor is open. Please feel free to ask questions or put forward your comments, reactions of all sorts.
Yeah, I have a question. So, yeah, you spoke about the need or the fact that you explored this lack of more intimate understanding between personal motivations in each activist. And I'm wondering, why is that? Why do we just sometimes maybe see each other only as comrades that are there to fight the fight, but we don't go a bit deeper? Because for me, that's a very powerful learning opportunity. And it's also this lack of intimate understanding of each other's motivations or fears or whatever is one of the things that make it easier for movements to not be successful and to break down and not win ultimately. So if you could maybe speak a bit more about this.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think maybe there's a few reasons. Some of them are structural and some of them are maybe more psychological that I can imagine. I think structurally, part of the problem is that there's not a lot of space or time for that. I think most of the activists that we worked with in this project, we almost needed to even trick them into taking 3 hours to do the interview. We would be like, no, the interview is going to be 1 hour. And then the interview would be so like engaging. They'd be like, no, we can stay. We can stay. Because I think there's a sense that activists are very, very, very busy. I mean, most people are already trying to survive within a capitalist economy, so they don't have a lot of time away from work. Many of the activists we talked with were parents or caregivers in various ways. And then, there's a feeling that there's so few people working on these issues that you need to be working on them all the time. And that means there's not a lot of like time to actually get together and learn about each other in a deep way. I think also, and again, I don't know if this is just part of the Canadian context. As a society, I don't think we train ourselves or train young people to take much of an interest in other people on a deep level. It even is a bit awkward when someone you've met maybe in a professional context or an activist context, it's like you go for coffee and they're like interrogating you and you're like, what? Wait, why are you asking me about my childhood? And my
Yeah, that's
hopes and
usually
dreams.
me. I'm usually that person.
Well, the key I found is if you want to do that, you just have to call yourself a researcher. And then
Okay.
everyone's like, oh, it's legitimate.
I'll put the note here, like the sign.
So I think that's part of it. I think there's also part of it that like there's like a long history on the left in general of a certain kind of like hardness. And I think it probably comes from, in left history, at least in the ways that it came down to me through like Leninism, basically, and the idea of the party and the perfect cadre, which I think was really destructive. Yeah, I think there was this sense that like that you should present yourself, even if you don't come from that tradition, that radical tradition, even if you don't like agree with it and you think it's terrible. I think there's been a way in which, at least within what I understand to be the West, quote unquote, there's been a kind of weird merger of left-wing professional revolutionary ideas and the Protestant work ethic. So it's like the ideal is to be a kind of invulnerable, perfect fighter for justice, a self-sacrificing millenarian fighter for justice. And this is even true of people who wouldn't identify in any way with Leninism that we interviewed. There was the sense that if you weren't kind of bottling up your pain and working through it and being kind of invulnerable, you were kind of a drag on the movement in a certain way. And I think that is a very strong part of the tradition that means that people don't really want to be particularly vulnerable or and so then not actually connect on a deep way. but I would say two things about that. I mean, one of them is, I think in the years since we did this project, there's been a lot of really interesting work that's come out that's challenged that. I think mostly coming out of feminist and queer movements where people are like, no, we're all pretty fucked up, and we need to actually develop movements that are built based on new forms of care for one another. And I think there's a lot about that that's really, really valuable. And already when we were doing our project in ethnography in 2010, a lot of people were talking about that movements also needed to be spaces of care and spaces of conviviality. This is also something that came out a lot, at least in North America, from Latin American movements and movements led by Latin American activists, where that's a much stronger part of the culture and the ethos. At the same time, I think both Alex and I eventually came to a position that we're not necessarily sold on that, if only because sometimes in that contradiction I was mentioning at the end, where the social movement becomes both a laboratory for a different world and also an engine or a kind of a motor to get to a different world. Sometimes what we observed is that people were better served if they had other friend groups other than the social movement, because otherwise things can get very, very insular. And we saw a lot of movements descend into kind of a complete closing in on themselves, where they would focus exclusively on care for one another or endless sort of conflict resolution within themselves, and then kind of forget about having an impact on the world. So it's a contradiction. I don't think there's any solution to it.
I see that there are more comments and questions incoming. I just want to remind Max's invitation to reflect on what of the things that he shared in his presentation are relevant, are ringing a bell in the Bulgarian context as well. So I think that's an interesting major part of the discussion as well. Kalina.
Yes, thank you very much for the talk. Once again, very inspiring. I'm one of these people who are always saying that, okay, we are comrades and we are not necessarily and don't need to necessarily be friends. And I think this is important, not because this comes from a place of not caring about others, but because if it is only about friendships, then it's very easy to put exactly what you were saying, Max, these personal, even issues, not like, this doesn't come from a place of non-understanding of personal situations. It comes from a place that tries to put the political a little bit more to the front, because sometimes you don't like the person that you are comrade with, right? I mean, you don't like everyone in a movement, and you don't need to, on a personal level, like everyone, and that's completely fine. This doesn't mean, however, that you don't cherish their qualities, or that you don't respect their political views, or that you don't like what they're doing, or that you cannot organize with them. You just don't want to be friends, and that's fine. So I mean, for me, this is a very important thing. However, I can also reflect how this vision sometimes is very cruel, you know. I mean, it gets very cold towards the people. You know, someone is coming with their needs, and with a comrade is coming to you, and then you're like, no, we're comrades, we're not friends. You know, it's cold. It's not nice. So this is a very tricky balance, a very tricky one, and no resolution or anything. I just like wanted to share that for me, being comrades doesn't equal being friends. They're not mutually exclusive, but they don't need to go hand in hand in any case. And then in terms of whatever you presented resonating with our Bulgarian reality, I think this sense of constant failure or failing to achieve whatever it is, like, hits so deep, like, like really putting a finger into the wound and salting it like repeatedly. Because I don't, one of the collectives that I'm part of, this magazine Diversity, our motto is driving, going forward for a better failure. So, it's like failure or thinking about failure is something that we have been doing a lot, while at the same time, this is exactly what, this was very, very interesting. This is exactly what you were saying with Diversio. Diversio started something that wanted to change or at least shift the debate, the public debate towards different, more left-wing perspective. In a sense, in a very smaller, on a very small scale, maybe it achieved this, maybe it's a place where people go to, but what it achieved is something completely different. It achieved a community around it. It achieved the fact that people who don't necessarily have political, political affiliation or a collective, yet they're kind of gathering there and then informing themselves, and then this is a place where dispersed people from all backgrounds within the left are coming to read or learn things that they have. So in this sense, this is fulfilling a very, very important job, and this is just not the thing that was initially envisioned. But that's okay. I mean, that's really fine. And then finally, I wanted to reflect on the label of radical imagination. I was so impressed that you said, oh, in Halifax, this small city. I mean, I checked, the population is, it's roughly as if we were talking about Vidin in Bulgarian standards. So in Vidin, having so many organizations that are against poverty, feminist, queer, environmental, this already sounds dystopian for the Bulgarian standards, right? But what I have seen a lot is that people really, even active people within NGOs, movements and so on. So, let's take, I don't know, Roma activists or people within Roma organizations. They're doing tremendous work and everything. They would never, ever, ever call themselves radicals. Never. I mean, this label is a no-go. So, talking about radical imagination, people run away from the label radical as much as they can because it invokes, different associations. So I don't know how this, to what extent this relates. Yeah, I was speaking a lot. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was thinking, and I commented in the chat actually, because of Max's advice to put a label researcher. But then the problem in Bulgaria is, in Bulgarian, researcher doesn't mean to search something. It means to explore. And I think this is a basic problem with imagination as well, because also of what Kali was talking about, there should be always some sort of a goal. We believe very often that any exploration, any research, any endeavor has to be teleological. There should be a goal, an end. There should be a final vision or something like that. Like, say, we are striving towards anarchism, which is a paradox, because anarchism for me is the least teleological movement, or that you should be striving towards communism or anarcho-communism or human rights or whatever. So we are ourselves, and I'm not saying this is in Bulgaria only. I mean, it's I don't want to blame on our lack of imagination, but this idea of having a final goal instead of going with an open mind and thinking is kind of limiting the ways we can imagine a different world. And to me, it seems that radical imagination, the way you described it, should be, if I understood correctly, it should be something which is not limited by a teleological end. It has to be autotelic. It has to be an end in itself. So kind of that's how I see the radical imagination. I don't see it necessarily as radical left, but I see it as a radical approach towards infinite possibilities. That
Yeah,
wasn't the
absolutely.
question. It's more like thoughts that are coming from what you've been talking about.
Yeah, certainly. And I think for Castoriadis, the word radical means, it just comes from the Latin source, which is a word for the root, like the roots of a plant or the roots of a tree. So it's not, it doesn't have that kind of, for him, it doesn't have that kind of value, that political value attached to it. Yeah, and I think we often ran into this problem with academics as well, where we'd be like, our research doesn't have an objective. The purpose is the process rather than the endpoint. And there are many traditions of sociological research and social science research that does that, but it's still, yeah, people have a hard time wrapping their heads around it sometimes, I think.
Still marginal, more or less.
Yeah, yeah. And it's also marginal to say that the purpose of the project is to have the relation, like to have these relations with other people in certain ways. Transformative relations. Yeah. It's hard to quantify.
Robin?
Yeah, hi. This was a lovely representation. Thank you so much. I was wondering, because at some point you mentioned about people that you broke trust with during that process back in 2017. And because a big part of, I think, movements here in Bulgaria is exactly about there's this always unanswered question about who do we exclude and why, and like, who do we not allow within our spaces. I was wondering, do you notice like a certain type of people that like, who are the people that were sort of not trusted within this process? And how did you navigate that? Because it's complicated. It's really tough.
So complicated. So complicated. Oh my goodness. There were a number of things that happened. I mean, one thing that happened is some people that we interviewed basically wanted to kind of, in a weird way, like they realized quite quickly that we had built up a lot of trust within the milieu. We called it the milieu rather than community. Like this sort of, from the French word, like the kind of space, a kind of let's say an ecosystem of social movements. I think when certain groups realized that we'd built a lot of trust within it, they kind of wanted to manipulate us, and we had to kind of cut them out because they wanted to kind of capitalize on our success. So the one that I'll say is like a really doctrinaire Marxist-Leninist movement who would just basically show up to all of our events and insist on giving these incredibly long and frustrating speeches that were actually really insulting to everyone else. Because they were basically like, here's the reason why everyone in this room is wrong and we're right. It's a very particular way of doing politics that I don't like very much. But at a certain point, we had to tell them they couldn't come anymore. And then they, of course, sort of targeted us and were like, oh, these people are, academic, exploiters. And it was very disingenuous on their part, but that was kind of their politics also, was to be quite disingenuous and ruthless. So that was one breaking of trust. And that actually did some damage because they had also cultivated relationships with other people in the community. And so then those people came to distrust us. In another incident, a very well-known male activist was sort of accused of, it was not sort of sexual violence, but just like being a kind of very uncomfortable presence by a lot of women in the community. But it was more of a sort of rumor rather than a direct accusation. I think when that happened in about 2010 or 2011, the language and the processes weren't as developed as they are today. And that meant there was a big break in the community of people taking a wide range of positions. And we determined we would cut ties with this guy, but that caused a lot of distrust. And the process of going through it also was like a lot of difficulty around that. I'm not sure in the end we made the right decision in that circumstance, but I don't know if we could have made a different decision at that moment. That was a big thing. And then there was also, I think, a lot of distrust that came up because there were like a lot of deep wounds within the community, like people who'd done bad things to each other, people who'd been in relationships, like romantic relationships with each other that hadn't spoken for years, but were always at the same demonstrations. And we were sort of interviewing both. We ended up learning a lot about people's backstory. As I mentioned, like we ended up kind of being therapists to a certain extent, I guess, for some people. And I think that also led to some distrust because people didn't know what we knew, right? They didn't know what someone had told me in the interview with their ex, which kind of got a bit awkward. And, we can all imagine what that would be like. And, you can imagine what it would be like if there was an actual therapist. They're bound by a certain set of ethical responsibilities. So are we as academics, very much so, but people are not as familiar with those. And so that also led to some distrust because people didn't know. We'd be asking like, what do you wish you could say to other people in the movement milieu that you can't say? And smart people hear that and they're like, you've also asked this question to everyone else. So I wonder what everyone else said. And if I am the subject of, so just, your standard narcissisms and everything else, I think led to all sorts of different kinds of tensions.
I think it's super interesting that of all the things that Max discussed in his presentation, most of this Q&A part kind of is focused on perhaps this the social reproduction dimensions of movements and the internal dynamics and structures and horizons of movements, because of course this was a major point of your presentation, but certainly not the only one. So I'm just curious how that emerged to be the focus for most of the questions and comments so far. We have a few more minutes, just a few more minutes before we go for a break. So we have time for just perhaps one reaction or comment. I know that this is, it may be difficult to take the one remaining place, but please do.
I'm gonna go for it. A lot of thoughts are alive inside of me, and I just wanted to say, Max, that yes, we relate because a few times, or yes, I relate at least, because a few times you said that these dynamics might not be relevant for Bulgaria or for non, how should I say it? Like white Protestant communities historically, yes.
Yeah.
And I find that many activists, regardless of where they are in the world, are Western educated, or the people that call themselves leftists often are. And this has me thinking about exploring indigenous forms of activism. And it doesn't seem applicable to call it with this word, but I wonder our ancestors, let's say 3, 4, 5 generations back, what did they used to do in order to dream about and build a utopian world and to reimagine their social dynamics and relations and do some kind of radical acts in order to transform society and move towards something better. And this has me thinking about spirituality and the kind of spiritual beliefs that are also part of the personal motivation of activists that are not discussed at all. Not just family histories or childhood or education, but I believe also spirituality can play a part in a person's
the individual motivations to take political action. And okay, if we want to break down the Protestant work ethic that you're saying has infiltrated social movements and this kind of, how should I say it, I forgot the word, where you're just kind of taking on the struggle and bottling it up. So
Yeah.
if we want to break down this approach, then I feel like there's a vacuum there, and we do need some kind of alternative to talk about spirituality and how it can be a part of our lives as activists outside of the hegemonic structures of organized religion that have caused so much suffering and oppression across generations.
Mhm.
Okay, I guess that's enough for now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's not so much time to go into it, but
Yes.
after the Radical Imagination Project, I moved to this even smaller Canadian city of Thunder Bay, and there I did a bunch of activist work with Indigenous activists from Canada, Anishinaabe activists, and yeah, it turned a lot of what I thought I knew on my head. I would say it's a very, very different. Yeah, a lot of people also live very traditional lifestyles, and yeah, it's really interesting. And just to echo what you were saying, I think for a lot of the Indigenous people I worked with there, there was no clear line between politics and what we would call spirituality, or what we might call like cosmology. And there was no clear line between spirituality and cosmology and like a way of living and being in the world. And one of the things that just briefly, one of the ways that manifested is in a completely different sense of time and the politics of how long things take. So, for them, they were fighting against a 500-year process of genocide. And they were like, it's probably going to take another 500 years. So like, we shouldn't, like, there's no need to rush. Like, and for me, that was very, very difficult to come to terms with. Yeah, but there was just one of many, many different sorts of things that I learned. Yeah, I'm still trying to wrap my head around.